The most terrifying silence is not the quiet before the storm, but the cold, deliberate stillness within a man who has decided he has nothing left to say. It is in that profound quiet that justice no longer seeks an audience, but simply sharpens its own blade. In a grand mansion nestled in the crisp autumn suburbs of Connecticut, such a silence was descending upon Arthur Morgan. At 78 years old, he sat in his mahogany-paneled study, a room built by the success of his own two hands, surrounded by books he had read and artifacts he had collected. His hands, though now spotted with age, were the same hands that had turned raw timber into an empire of fine woods, a legacy of quality and integrity. But the legacy now sitting before him was of a different, more bitter kind. His 3 children, Leo, Clara, and Ethan, stood before his desk. They had not come for fatherly advice, nor for a warm embrace. They had come as an expeditionary force, armed with a sharp-suited lawyer and a sheaf of papers that felt colder than the morning air. Leo, the eldest, the one groomed to take the throne, was the spokesman. His voice, stripped of any familial warmth, was rehearsed and sterile. "Father," he began, "we are doing this for your own good. It has become clear that you are no longer capable of managing your affairs." Clara, his daughter, ever the performer, dabbed at a dry eye and added, "We are just so worried about you, Daddy. You seem so confused lately." Ethan, the youngest, the one who still had a flicker of a soul, said nothing at all. He simply stared at a point on the Persian rug, his silence a testament to his spineless complicity. The lawyer stepped forward and placed the documents on Arthur's polished desk. A petition to the court, a request for a competency hearing. Words like cognitive decline and fiduciary responsibility leaped from the page, clinical terms designed to strip a man of his dignity, his autonomy, and his life's work. Arthur did not flinch. He did not rage or plead as they might have expected. He simply looked at them, one by one. His gaze not of a fading old man, but of a seasoned general surveying a battlefield he knew intimately. He saw not his children, but the hollow husks of their ambition, the grotesque reflections of the greed he had unwittingly enabled. There was a long, heavy pause, a silence so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a drumbeat marching towards a grim conclusion. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. When they finally turned and left, leaving the papers and their betrayal lingering in the air, Arthur remained perfectly still. No tears welled in his eyes. Instead, as the heavy oak door clicked shut, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips. It was not a smile of happiness or of madness. It was a smile of grim satisfaction. The first move had been played, just as he had anticipated. The storm they thought they were creating was not for him to weather. It was for him to unleash. To understand the chilling calm that settled over Arthur Morgan, you must first understand the man himself, not as the frail patriarch his children wished to see, but as the formidable architect of a world they had only ever inhabited. His story did not begin in the manicured lawns of Connecticut. It began decades earlier, with the salt spray of the Atlantic on his face, and nothing in his pockets but calloused hands and a vocabulary of 2 English words, please and work. He arrived in America as a ghost, a young man fleeing a land of old sorrows, determined to build something that could not be taken from him. He found his solace not in people, who were often fickle, but in the steadfast honesty of wood. He learned its language, the secrets held within its grain, the way it yielded to a patient hand and a sharp tool. His first workshop was a rented corner of a dusty garage, cold in the winter, suffocating in the summer. He worked while others slept, his only companions the scent of pine and oak, and the steady rhythm of his own sanding and sawing. He poured his loneliness, his hope, and his unwavering discipline into every joint and finish. He wasn't just building furniture, he was building a new identity, one piece at a time. This was the genesis of Morgan & Sons Fine Woods. The name itself was a promise, a dream of a future dynasty built on the foundation of his sweat. In the early years, the business was just him. He was the designer, the craftsman, the salesman, and the delivery man. He learned that a reputation, like a mighty oak, grows slowly but has deep roots. His pieces were known not for being the cheapest, but for being the best. Each cabinet, each table, each chair was a testament to his philosophy that true value lies in substance, not in appearance. He despised the culture of the disposable, the quick, and the easy. To him, a thing worth making was a thing worth making last for generations. And as his reputation grew, so did his business. The dusty garage gave way to a proper workshop, then a sprawling facility. He hired craftsmen who shared his vision, men and women who understood that they were not merely assembling products, but continuing a tradition. Arthur Morgan built an empire, not of stocks and leveraged buyouts, but of tangible, beautiful things that brought warmth and permanence to people's homes. He had created the very kingdom his children were now trying to usurp. The heart of that kingdom, for over 4 decades, had been his wife, Eleanor. She was the grace note to his stoic melody, the one person who could read the volumes of unspoken thoughts behind his quiet eyes. Eleanor had been the bridge between Arthur and the world, and more importantly, between Arthur and his children. She understood his relentless drive because she shared his humble origins, but she also understood the language of the new world their children were born into, a world of effortless comfort and entitlement. She was the one who would drag him from the workshop for family dinners, who would translate his silent pride into words of affection, who would remind him that a family, unlike a business, cannot be run on discipline alone. She was the warmth that kept the house from becoming a museum. When she died 10 years ago, the bridge collapsed. The warmth leached out of the grand house, and the silence Arthur had once shared comfortably with her became a vast, empty chasm. It was in the decade after her death that he truly began to see his children for what they were. He had given them everything he never had: the best schools, cars on their 16th birthdays, trust funds that guaranteed they would never know the gnawing fear of an empty cupboard. He had done so out of love, believing he was protecting them from the hardships he had endured. He realized too late that in shielding them from the struggle, he had robbed them of the strength it builds. They grew up fluent in the language of taking, but illiterate in the language of earning. They saw Morgan and Sons not as a living legacy of their father's soul, but as a machine that printed money. Leo, his firstborn, was the most eager to seize control. He saw his father's traditional methods as archaic and inefficient. He spoke of optimizing supply chains and leveraging brand identity, cold corporate jargon that was anathema to Arthur's craft. Leo wanted to replace seasoned artisans with automated assembly lines, to trade solid oak for cheap particle board, to put the Morgan name on mass-produced garbage. To Arthur, this was not business, it was blasphemy. Clara, his beautiful and pampered daughter, had married a man as shallow as she was. They saw Arthur's estate as their personal bank, a resource to be drained for their lavish lifestyles. Her visits became less about family and more like audits, her questions always circling back to assets, holdings, and timelines for his retirement. She complained about his stubbornness, as if it were a personal affront to her social calendar. And then there was Ethan, the youngest, the great disappointment. Ethan had a gentle heart, and for a time, Arthur had hoped he might carry the true flame of the family legacy. He had a natural eye for the beauty of the wood, a quiet patience that reminded Arthur of himself. But Ethan's gentleness was curdled by a crippling weakness. He was terrified of his older siblings, easily manipulated by Leo's ambition and Clara's emotional blackmail. He stood by, a silent accomplice, as they plotted their patricide by paperwork. Arthur had watched these seeds of discontent grow for years, fertilized by his own wealth and his emotional absence after Eleanor's passing. The betrayal, therefore, did not shock him. It merely confirmed a conclusion he had reached long ago in the quiet solitude of his study. His children had inherited his fortune, but not a single splinter of his values. And a kingdom without values is just a pile of bricks and stone, waiting for the right storm to knock it all down. The seeds of the Morgan family's discontent were sown in the fertile ground of privilege, but they were watered by the cold absence of a mother's love and a father's presence. After Eleanor passed, the grand house remained, the staff still moved with quiet efficiency, and the money continued to flow, but the soul of the family had been hollowed out. Family dinners, once boisterous affairs filled with Eleanor's laughter, became tense, obligatory rituals. They were boardroom meetings disguised with fine china, and the unspoken agenda was always the same: Arthur's impending obsolescence. The discontent festered differently in each of his children, like a poison that adapts to its host. For Leo, the eldest, it was a gnawing impatience that curdled into resentment. At 45, he was the CEO of Morgan & Sons in title only. He held the scepter, but his father still sat on the throne. Leo was a product of a prestigious business school, a man who believed the world could be understood through spreadsheets and profit and loss statements. He saw his father's company not as a legacy, but as an underperforming asset. He would walk through the main workshop, a place that smelled of history and honest labor, and see only inefficiency. He saw artisans who took a week to perfect a single dovetail joint and thought only of the man-hours wasted. He saw stacks of rare, air-dried timber and calculated the cost of the warehouse space it occupied. His dream was to gut the company's artisan soul. He envisioned a future of outsourcing production to factories in Asia, slapping the Morgan & Sons logo on flat-packed furniture, and selling the brand's heritage without the costly burden of maintaining its quality. His father was the single, unmovable obstacle to this lucrative vision. Every conversation about the business became a clash of civilizations. "Father, we have to adapt to the market," Leo would argue, his voice tight with frustration. "This sentimentality for the craft is costing us millions in potential growth." Arthur would simply look at him with those clear, unwavering eyes and reply, "There is no market for things with no soul, Leo. We sell permanence, not potential." For Leo, this wasn't a philosophical disagreement, it was a personal insult. It was his father telling him, yet again, that he wasn't good enough, that his modern vision was worthless. Clara's discontent was less about power and more about lifestyle. At 42, she lived in a state of perpetual, high-end anxiety. Her life was a carefully curated performance of wealth, played out in country clubs and on the charity gala circuit. Her husband, Gregory, a man whose ambition was matched only by his lack of scruples, was a constant voice in her ear. He spoke of their friends who were chartering yachts in the Mediterranean, buying private islands, whose parents had the good sense to transfer their wealth through modern trusts that maximized tax benefits and minimized parental oversight. Gregory saw Arthur as a stubborn old dragon sitting on a hoard of gold that could be, and should be, put to better use, namely, funding their ascent to the stratosphere of the social elite. Clara adopted his perspective as her own. She began to see her father's prudence as a personal slight. "Daddy, the Vanderbilts just donated a new wing to the museum," she would lament over the phone. "We could be doing so much more if the family assets were just managed more progressively." Arthur knew progressively was a code word for liquidated and transferred to her account. He saw through her feigned interest in philanthropy. Clara didn't want to build a legacy. She wanted to buy a bigger tiara for the next ball. Her father's refusal to simply hand over his fortune felt like an active punishment, a deliberate withholding of the life she felt she was owed. And then there was Ethan. At 35, the youngest was the family's tragic echo of a conscience. He was the only one who didn't actively despise his father's principles. In fact, a part of him admired them. He would sometimes wander into the old workshop alone, running his hand over a piece of unfinished cherry wood, remembering the rare days when his father had tried to teach him the craft. But Ethan was born with a spine made of jelly. He was financially dependent on the allowance managed by Leo and emotionally susceptible to Clara's dramatic sighs of disappointment. He was a passenger in the conspiracy, racked with guilt, but too cowardly to grab the wheel. In family arguments, he would remain silent, his eyes downcast, hoping the storm would pass. His silence was his sin. It was a tacit endorsement of his siblings' plans, a betrayal born not of malice, but of a profound and pathetic weakness. Arthur's heart ached most for Ethan, for in him he saw the ghost of the son he had hoped for, forever trapped within the shell of the man he had actually become. The breaking point, the moment the unspoken discontent finally found its voice, came during what would be their last family dinner. It was the anniversary of Eleanor's death, a day Arthur insisted they honor together. The long mahogany table, a masterpiece he had built for her decades ago, felt more like a barrier than a gathering place. Her empty chair at the opposite end seemed to watch them with silent judgment. Trying to fill the tense silence, Arthur mentioned a new commission he had just accepted: a grand library for a university, a project that would take years of meticulous, handcrafted work. Leo put his fork down with a sharp clink. "Years?" he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Father, that's absurd. We should be focusing on scalable projects, not passion projects." "The board is getting restless," Clara chimed in, perfectly on cue. "He's right, Daddy. You should be enjoying your retirement, not taking on more work. Let Leo handle the business." The trap was sprung. Arthur looked at them, his gaze sweeping from Leo's arrogant smirk to Clara's feigned concern, and finally to Ethan's terrified face. "The business," Arthur said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of the entire room, "is my life. It is about creating things of value." "What, exactly, have you three ever created?" The question hung in the air, a stunningly direct blow. Leo began to sputter about stock performance and market share, but Arthur cut him off. "I am not talking about money. I am talking about value, about character. You see this company as a vault to be emptied. I see it as a legacy to be preserved. And I am beginning to believe that none of you are worthy of it." The words landed like stones. The dinner ended in a frigid silence. As his children left that night, their faces a mixture of fury and indignation. Arthur Morgan knew their polite suggestions and veiled complaints were over. They had tried to persuade him, and they had failed. Now, they would try to remove him. He sat alone at the head of the great table, the ghost of his wife beside him, and prepared for the war they had just declared. The final, irreparable severing of familial bonds did not happen with a fiery explosion, but with the quiet, clinical precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It came 2 weeks after the disastrous anniversary dinner, on a Tuesday morning so ordinary and bright that the cruelty of the act felt all the more obscene. Arthur was in his study, holding a small, intricately carved bird his wife had loved. He was tracing the delicate lines of its wings with his thumb when the door opened without a knock. Leo entered first, his face a mask of grim determination. He was flanked by Clara, who clutched her pearl necklace like a rosary, and their lawyer, a man whose polished shoes and predatory smile seemed to suck the warmth from the room. Ethan trailed behind them, a human shadow of guilt, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. The air, which moments before had been filled with quiet contemplation, suddenly became thick and suffocating, charged with the energy of a long-planned ambush. The lawyer, a Mr. Shaw, cleared his throat and took the lead, his voice as smooth and cold as river stones. "Mr. Morgan," he began, "my clients have asked me to be here today to discuss a matter of some delicacy regarding your ongoing health and the future stewardship of the family's assets." Arthur placed the wooden bird down on his desk with deliberate care, his movements slow and steady. He said nothing, simply fixing his gaze on his children, forcing them to bear the weight of their own actions. The silence stretched, and Mr. Shaw, unaccustomed to such unflinching stillness, faltered for a moment. Leo, ever impatient, stepped forward to fill the void. "Father, what he means to say is that we've made a decision," Leo announced, his tone an offensive blend of boardroom authority and false empathy. "We have consulted with several specialists, and we've been advised that the most responsible course of action is to petition for a conservatorship." The word hung in the air, ugly and invasive. Conservatorship. It was a legal term for erasure, a declaration that a man was no longer a man, but a problem to be managed. Clara, seeing her cue, stepped forward and produced a tear, a single perfect droplet that rolled down her cheek without disturbing her makeup. "We just can't bear to see you struggling anymore, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling with practiced sorrow. "Last week, you couldn't remember your own driver's name. You're not the man you used to be." It was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of fiction. Arthur remembered his driver's name, his wife's birthday, and the exact day, 35 years ago, that Ethan had been born. More importantly, he remembered this precise moment, a moment he had foreseen with heartbreaking clarity. He turned his gaze to his youngest son. "Ethan?" he asked, his voice level. "Is this what you want?" Ethan flinched as if struck. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He could only shake his head slightly before Leo shot him a look that silenced him completely. That single, cowardly gesture was Ethan's answer. It was the deepest cut of all. Mr. Shaw, regaining his composure, slid a thick folder across the vast expanse of the mahogany desk. The cover page was stark. "In the matter of the conservatorship of Arthur Morgan." Arthur didn't need to read it. He knew what it contained. Pages of fabricated evidence of his decline, affidavits from disgruntled former employees Leo had bribed, and the cold, dehumanizing language of the law, all designed to paint him as a doddering old fool who was a danger to himself and his own fortune. He looked down at the documents, then back up at the faces of his children, the people he had created, nurtured, and loved. In their eyes, he saw no doubt, no remorse. He saw only the finish line. They believed they had won. They saw a frail, defeated old man, cornered and helpless. They had no idea they were looking at their own executioner. Arthur leaned back in his chair, a profound calm settling over him. "If that is all," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, "you may leave now." They were so taken aback by his lack of resistance that they simply stared for a moment. This was not the fight they had prepared for. Convinced his spirit was finally broken, Leo gave a curt nod. "The hearing is in 3 weeks. We hope you'll cooperate, Father, for everyone's sake." They turned and walked out, leaving the folder on his desk like a time bomb. The moment the door clicked shut, the stillness in the room changed. It was no longer the quiet of defeat, but the focused silence of a grandmaster at a chessboard. Arthur did not look at the folder again. He swiveled his chair to face a small, unassuming side table, on which sat a single, old-fashioned rotary telephone. It was a private line, a number known to only one other person on Earth. He picked up the heavy receiver and dialed the number from memory. It rang only once. "David," Arthur said, his voice now devoid of any emotion except for a cold, hard resolve. A familiar, steady voice came back through the line. "Arthur, from the timing of this call, I take it the wolves have finally delivered their summons." "They have," Arthur confirmed. "They brought their lawyer. It's official." There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of a man taking a deep breath before a long-awaited battle. "So it begins," David Davies said, his voice grim. "Yes," Arthur replied, his gaze shifting to the window, to the ancient oak tree that had stood on the property for centuries, a silent witness to it all. "It's time, David. Launch Operation Silent Storm." David's response was immediate and certain. "The winds are already rising, my friend. They will never know what hit them." Arthur gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. The first cut had been made, and it was deeper than any blade could manage. But it was not a mortal wound. It was a declaration of war. And Arthur Morgan had just moved his first piece in a game his children had no idea they were even playing. The children's strategy required an inside source, a witness who could provide the intimate daily proof of their father's decline. To this end, they hired Maria Flores. On paper, she was a highly qualified home care nurse with impeccable references. In their minds, she was a spy, a paid observer whose sole purpose was to document every forgotten name, every moment of supposed confusion, every sign of frailty that their lawyers could twist into a narrative of incompetence. When Leo and Clara interviewed her, they laid out their story with practiced sincerity. "He's a wonderful man, a legend," Leo had said, leaning forward with a confidential air. "But he's slipping. We need someone to be here, to keep him safe, and to keep a log of any incidents. It's for his own protection, you understand," Clara had added. "Just little things. If he misplaces his glasses or seems agitated for no reason, note it down. The doctors say a detailed record is very helpful." Maria, a woman who had seen the complex and often ugly dynamics of wealthy families up close for 20 years, simply nodded, her face a mask of professional empathy. She knew her role was to be a pawn, but she had long ago learned that pawns see more of the board than the kings and queens often realize. Her first week in the Morgan mansion was an exercise in observation. She found a house that was less of a home and more of a gilded cage, a place of profound and heavy silence. And at its center was Arthur Morgan, a man who was nothing like the confused, irascible patient she had been briefed on. He was quiet, yes, but it was the quiet of a deep river, not a stagnant pond. He was organized, his routines precise, and his mind sharp. He would read for hours in his study, work on intricate wood carvings in his small personal workshop, and tend to a stunning collection of orchids in a glass greenhouse. He greeted her each morning with a polite, "Good morning, Maria," and thanked her each evening. He never misplaced his glasses. He was never agitated for no reason. The only agitation Maria witnessed was a quiet sadness that would sometimes settle in his eyes when he looked at a photograph of his late wife. Maria began her log as instructed, but its contents were not what the children were hoping for. 8:15 a.m. Mr. Morgan completed the New York Times crossword puzzle in ink. 11:30 a.m. Discussed the geopolitical implications of a recent trade agreement with surprising acuity. 3 p.m. Recounted a detailed, humorous story from his childhood. The children's attempts to manufacture evidence were clumsy and insulting. One afternoon, Clara arrived for one of her fleeting, performative visits. While Maria was preparing tea in the kitchen, she saw Clara move a small, silver-framed photograph of Eleanor from its long-held place on the fireplace mantel to a low bookshelf, partially hidden behind a vase. Later, in front of Maria, Clara put on a show. "Oh, Daddy, where is that lovely picture of Mother?" she asked, her voice oozing false concern. "It's always on the mantel. I hope you haven't put it somewhere and forgotten." Arthur looked from the empty spot on the mantel to Clara's expectant face, and then his eyes met Maria's for a fraction of a second. A flicker of mutual understanding passed between them. He then turned back to his daughter, his expression one of mild confusion. "The picture?" he mused. "Ah, yes. You know, your mother always did hate being the center of attention. Perhaps she simply decided to step out of the spotlight for a while." Clara's face tightened. The calculated ambiguity of his answer gave her nothing to use, and she left in a huff. Maria, however, understood perfectly. He wasn't losing his mind. He was playing a game whose rules only he understood. Her suspicions were confirmed by the phone calls. Thinking Maria was just part of the furniture, they spoke freely around her. She heard Leo in the hall, his voice a low growl into his phone. "I don't care what his current numbers look like. Just find a pretense to liquidate the timber assets before the hearing. We need to show a pattern of erratic financial decisions." She saw Clara gliding through the garden, speaking to her husband. "Gregory, darling, once this is all over, we are buying the house in Aspen. I saw the most divine sable coat that would be perfect for the winter season." Never once did Maria hear a word of genuine concern, a whisper of love, or a hint of sadness for the man they were systematically dismantling. They were not children grieving a father's decline. They were predators circling their prey, impatient for the kill. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Maria one rainy afternoon. She found Arthur in the greenhouse, gently misting the petals of a white orchid. "This was Eleanor's favorite," he said, his voice soft. She said it reminded her that the most beautiful things are often the most delicate. He then turned to Maria, his eyes clear and direct. "They hired you to watch me, I know," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "Tell me, Maria, what have you seen?" In that moment, Maria's professional detachment shattered, replaced by a fierce, protective indignation. She saw a good man being betrayed by the very people he had given everything to. Her choice was clear. She could no longer be a pawn in their cruel game. She had to switch sides. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice steady, "I have seen a brilliant, kind man. And I have seen his children trying to steal his life from him." A slow, sad smile touched Arthur's lips. "Thank you, Maria," he said. "That is all I needed to know." That night, Maria began a second log, a secret one, hidden in a secure file on her personal tablet. In it, she documented everything: the verbatim quotes from their callous phone calls, the dates and times of their manipulative visits, Clara's stunt with the photograph. She became a double agent, playing the part of the dutiful employee for the children, while secretly becoming the eyes and ears of Operation Silent Storm. A few days later, using the pretense of picking up a prescription, she drove to a public library in a neighboring town. From a payphone, she dialed the number for the law offices of David Davies. "My name is Maria Flores," she said when the secretary answered. "Please tell Mr. Davies that I am calling about the Morgan case. Tell him the Observer has chosen a side. The game had a new player, one the children had foolishly placed in the very heart of their enemy's territory." With Maria now a loyal operative within the house, Operation Silent Storm transitioned from planning to performance. The strategy, conceived by Arthur and refined by the shrewd legal mind of David Davies, was one of audacious simplicity. They would give the children exactly what they wanted. They would build the case against Arthur Morgan for them, brick by meticulous brick, creating a fortress of lies so convincing that his children would walk into it, blind and triumphant, only to find themselves in a prison of their own making. The stage was the grand mansion. The audience was his 3 children and their lawyers, and Arthur Morgan, the titan of industry, was about to give the performance of a lifetime. His role was that of a man untethered from his own mind, a ghost haunting the halls of his former glory. The first step was to embrace the part. Arthur began by introducing small, deliberate errors into his daily routine, always when he knew Maria was observing or, even better, when the children were present. It began with him calling Leo by Ethan's name and Ethan by Leo's. He would catch himself, a look of theatrical frustration flashing across his face, and mutter, "Forgive me, my mind is a bit of a fog today." Leo and Clara would exchange a knowing, satisfied glance. "See? It's happening," their eyes would say. "He's finally breaking." He started leaving objects in strange places, his reading glasses in the refrigerator, a financial report in the greenhouse. Maria would discover them and report the oddities to the children with a carefully practiced tone of concern, adding layers of credibility to the charade. "I found your father's wallet in the linen closet this morning," she would tell Clara over the phone. "He had no memory of putting it there." Every lie she told was a small act of loyalty to the truth. The children, emboldened by these successes, had already taken the liberty of installing several small, discreet security cameras in the main living areas, citing safety concerns. They informed Arthur that it was to ensure he didn't fall or get into trouble when Maria wasn't in the room. Arthur, who had been alerted to their exact locations by Davies' security expert, feigned a sort of weary resignation. In reality, these cameras became his personal soundstage. He would stand in front of the fireplace, where a camera was nestled in the trim of a bookshelf, and have a loud, one-sided conversation with the portrait of his late wife, Eleanor. He would wander into the living room in the middle of the night and simply stand in the dark, a performance of senile restlessness designed specifically for the viewing pleasure of whichever sibling was monitoring the feeds that night. His greatest performance came during a visit from Leo, who arrived with a stack of quarterly reports and a condescendingly slow manner of speaking, as if addressing a child. "Father," Leo said, pointing to a signature line, "I need you to sign here. It's just a standard authorization for the payroll account." Arthur stared at the document for a long time, his brow furrowed. "Payroll?" he asked, looking up at Leo with vacant eyes. "Do I still work there? I thought I was a carpenter." Leo's jaw tightened, his frustration barely concealed by a veneer of pity. "No, Father, you own the company. You just need to sign." Arthur picked up the expensive fountain pen Leo offered. He held it awkwardly, as if it were a foreign object. He brought the nib down to the paper, but instead of signing his name, he began to sketch a small, intricate drawing of a bird. "I used to be able to carve these," he murmured, lost in a fictional memory. "Eleanor loved them." Leo snatched the pen from his hand. "That's enough," he snapped, his voice losing its patient facade. "We'll deal with this later." He stormed out, leaving the unsigned documents behind. From the kitchen, Maria had watched the entire exchange. Later that evening, in her secret log, she wrote, "Elle became visibly agitated, by his father's refusal to sign. Subject A's performance was flawless. The son believes the father is not only incompetent, but is now actively costing him money. His impatience is growing. This is good. The mask of frailty was a heavy one for Arthur to wear. It was a constant exercise in humiliation, a public dismantling of his own powerful identity. But beneath the surface of the doddering old man, the real Arthur Morgan was working with a clarity and speed his children could not have imagined. While they were busy collecting evidence of his weakness, he was demonstrating his greatest strength, his strategic mind. He used his confused state to his advantage, sowing chaos within the company that only he could untangle later. He would accidentally let slip contradictory instructions to two different department heads, causing minor but frustrating logistical snags for Leo. He would call Clara and ask her to explain a complex financial trust, pretending he couldn't grasp the details, forcing her to reveal her own ignorance of the very instruments she hoped to inherit. He was testing their greed, their intelligence, their patience, and finding all three severely lacking. They were so blinded by their proximity to the prize that they failed to see the trap being built around them. They saw his stumbles, his forgotten words, his vacant stares, and they mistook it for the end of the game. They saw a king who had lost his mind. They were too foolish to realize that he had simply disguised himself as a pawn, the most dangerous piece on the board, able to move in ways they would never anticipate. Each day, the mask felt more natural, the performance more refined. He was giving them a masterpiece of a story, a tragedy of a great man's decline. And they, in their arrogance, believed they were the authors of it, never once suspecting that they were merely characters in his, and that their role was that of the fool. By day, the Morgan mansion was a stage, and Arthur Morgan its leading actor. By night, when the house fell into a deep and watchful silence, it became a command center. The frail, forgetful old man who shuffled through the halls in the afternoon would vanish, and in his place, a ghost would emerge. Not the ghost of a fading mind, but the ghost in the machine, a silent, calculating force, moving the vast and invisible pieces of his empire with a precision his children could never comprehend. While they slept, dreaming of their imminent victory, Arthur was methodically dismantling the prize they were fighting for, all from the quiet solitude of his study. This room, which they had bugged with cameras to record his decay, was the one place he was truly alive, the war room of his silent, brilliant campaign. His primary co-conspirator was David Davies, connected not by a monitored phone line, but by a military-grade encrypted video link, routed through a dedicated satellite modem hidden within the guts of an antique radio. The laptop Arthur used was a state-of-the-art machine concealed within a hollowed-out legal encyclopedia on his shelf. To any observer, he was an old man, dozing in his chair. But in the virtual world, he was a king, commanding his forces with the quiet authority that had built a fortune. Their late-night sessions were a masterclass in strategy. Arthur, with his encyclopedic knowledge of his own holdings, was the grand strategist. David, with his razor-sharp legal and financial acumen, was his field marshal, executing the complex maneuvers in the outside world. The art collection in the East Wing, Arthur would say, his voice low and clear, his eyes fixed on the screen. Clara has already had it appraised for auction. I want it sold, not at auction. A private sale to the Metropolitan Museum. As an anonymous donation. I want it gone by Monday. Davies, from his own secure office miles away, would nod, making notes. The paperwork is already drafted, Arthur. I'll execute the transfer in the morning. They think it's coming from a European benefactor. The funds from the museum's token payment will be routed through the holding company in Zurich before being absorbed by the trust. This was the heart of the operation, a systematic and legal hollowing out of his own estate. They started with the assets the children were most eager to get their hands on. The portfolio of volatile tech stocks that Leo boasted about at his country club was liquidated. The profits rerouted and reinvested in stable, anonymous bonds held by a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. The vacation home in the Hamptons, where Clara and Gregory spent their summers, was sold to a shell company controlled by Davies, who then leased it to an unsuspecting third party. On paper, the house was gone, the capital from its sale a mere fraction of its worth due to market conditions. In reality, its value was secure, hidden behind layers of legal firewalls. Arthur took a quiet, grim satisfaction in severing these limbs of their entitlement. Each sale was a surgical strike, removing a piece of the future they had already planned for themselves. They were fighting over a map to a treasure that Arthur was, night by night, secretly reburying on an entirely different island. The centerpiece of this entire strategy was the creation of a new impregnable fortress for his wealth, the Eleanor Morgan Legacy Trust. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering, an irrevocable trust whose stated purpose was philanthropic, to preserve and promote the art of traditional American craftsmanship for future generations. Its assets were being fed by the constant, silent stream of liquidated funds from Arthur's old life. But its true power lay in its structure. The trust was a separate legal entity, a black hole into which assets could be transferred, forever removing them from the reach of the Morgan estate and, by extension, his children's grasp. The most devastating maneuver was the methodical transfer of the true sources of the company's wealth into this trust. While Leo was busy trying to manage the day-to-day operations of Morgan and Sons Fine Woods, the company was quietly being bled of its real value. The vast tracts of forest land in the Pacific Northwest, where their rarest timber was sustainably harvested, were sold to the trust for a nominal fee. The workshops and the land they sat on were similarly transferred. Even the company's most valuable intellectual property, the proprietary formulas for wood treatments and finishes that Arthur had perfected over 50 years, were legally signed over to the trust. What remained of Morgan and Sons was becoming a ghost itself. It still had the name, the employees, the production lines, but its foundations, the very ground it stood upon, and the secret knowledge that made it unique, now belonged to someone else. Arthur was leaving his children a beautiful, hollowed-out Fabergé egg. It looked magnificent from the outside, but inside, it was empty. They were fighting for control of a brand, not a business. The process was slow, meticulous, and invisible. Davies used proxies and cutouts, ensuring that almost no paperwork bore Arthur's recent signature. Every transaction was legal, every move defensible. They were creating a new reality, one that would be undeniable when the time came to reveal it. As the date of the competency hearing grew closer, the pace of their work intensified. The ghost in the machine worked tirelessly, fueled by coffee, conviction, and the memory of his wife's name, which he had bestowed upon the instrument of his justice. Often, as the first hint of dawn would break across the sky, Arthur would shut down his secret world. He would close the encyclopedia, turn off the antique radio, and transform back into his role. He would rise from his chair with a theatrical groan, practice a slight shuffle in his walk, and ready himself to face another day of his children's pity and condescension, the quiet smile of a general who has already won the war, playing on his lips in the pre-dawn light. Amid the cold, calculated maneuvers of his war, a ray of unexpected and genuine warmth entered Arthur Morgan's life. It did not come from his family or his past, but from a quiet, unassuming young woman named Sarah. She was a volunteer with the Artisans Guild Foundation, a non-profit Arthur had been anonymously funding for over 20 years, dedicated to supporting elderly craftspeople and fostering new talent. It was his one true philanthropy, a secret he had kept even from Eleanor, a way of honoring the world that had saved him. The Guild, unaware of his true identity, knew him only as Mr. Harding, a reclusive benefactor. They had asked if he would be willing to speak with one of their young volunteers, someone with a passion for woodworking, to simply share his stories and knowledge. Wary but intrigued, Arthur had agreed. He arranged for her to meet him not at the grand mansion, but at the small, private workshop he had built for himself at the far end of the property. A simple, rustic building that smelled of cedar and turpentine, a world away from the cold marble of his home. When Sarah arrived, she saw not a titan of industry, but a kind-faced old man in a worn leather apron, surrounded by the tools of his trade. She was in her early 30s, with an open, intelligent face and hands that were not perfectly manicured, but showed the nicks and calluses of someone who actually worked with them. Her presence was a balm. Unlike his children, she did not look at him with pity or impatience. She looked at him with reverence. Her eyes scanned the workshop, taking in the antique hand planes hanging on the wall, the stacks of rare, fragrant wood, the half-finished cello resting on a workbench. "This is incredible," she said, her voice filled with a genuine awe that Arthur had not heard in years. "This is a history of the craft, all in one room." Their first conversation was not about his health, his finances, or his family. It was about the comparative merits of Japanese and Western saw teeth, the lost art of French polishing, and the particular challenges of working with burled maple. She listened, not with the polite detachment of a subordinate, but with the focused intensity of a true student. She asked intelligent questions. She shared her own struggles with a small restoration project she was working on. For 2 hours, Arthur forgot he was playing a role. He wasn't a frail old man or a vengeful patriarch. He was simply a craftsman, a master sharing his life's passion with an eager and worthy apprentice. It was a feeling so pure and invigorating, it was like a drink of cool water after years in a desert. Sarah's visits became a weekly ritual, a protected space of authenticity in Arthur's carefully constructed world of deception. With Maria's quiet coordination, her visits were scheduled for times his children were unlikely to appear. In Sarah, Arthur saw the reflection of the child he had always hoped for. She possessed an innate understanding of his core philosophy, that the value of an object and of a life was in the care and integrity put into its creation. He told her stories he had never even told his own sons, tales of his first struggles, of the joy of completing a piece that was perfectly balanced and true. She, in turn, opened up about her own life. She had been raised by a single mother, a waitress who had worked tirelessly to provide for her. Her mother, she explained, had passed away a year ago, leaving a void in her life. She spoke of her with a deep and abiding love, but also a hint of mystery. "My mother was a wonderful woman," Sarah said one afternoon, as they were carefully sanding a small, inlaid box. "But she was private. She never spoke of my father. It was like her life began the day I was born." It was during their 4th or 5th visit that the earth shifted beneath Arthur's feet. Sarah was talking about her mother's love for beautiful things, and she pulled a worn, creased photograph from her wallet. "She carried this with her always," Sarah said, handing it to him. "It's the only picture I have of her when she was young." Arthur took the small, faded photograph. It showed a young woman with a familiar, wistful smile and eyes that held a hint of sorrow, standing in front of a carousel at a state fair. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The world around him seemed to recede, the scent of sawdust and varnish vanishing, replaced by the ghost of a memory from nearly 4 decades ago. The woman in the photograph was Amelia, a gentle, kind artist he had met and fallen for during a lonely summer of his life, a brief and intense romance before he had met Eleanor. A romance that had ended abruptly when she had moved away without a word. He looked from the photograph of the young Amelia to the face of the kind, intelligent woman sitting before him, and he saw it. The same shape of the eyes, the same gentle curve of the smile, a lifetime of unspoken questions, and a sudden, heart-stopping answer seemed to converge in that single moment. He felt a tremor in his hands, a feeling so profound it nearly broke through his carefully maintained composure. He handed the photo back to her, his movements stiff. "She was very beautiful," he managed to say, his voice thick with an emotion Sarah mistook for simple sentimentality. That night, the ghost in the machine had a new, urgent mission. His call to David Davies was different. The cold strategy was replaced by a raw, personal urgency. "David," he began, "I need you to do something for me. Off the books. A private matter. I need you to find everything you can about a woman named Amelia Rose. She would have lived in upstate New York around 40 years ago. More importantly, find out if she ever had a child." The appearance of Sarah had changed the nature of Arthur's war. It was no longer just a quest for justice and retribution against the ungrateful. It had become a mission of restoration. He was not just fighting to punish his heirs, he was fighting to find his heir. Sarah's visits continued, a source of genuine joy that fueled his resolve. The contrast was stark. An hour with his daughter Clara was a draining performance of feigned confusion. An hour with Sarah was a moment of true connection that reminded him what his legacy was truly about. It wasn't about the money or the company name. It was about passing on a passion, a set of values, a piece of his soul. And in this gentle, unsuspecting volunteer, he dared to believe he had finally found a vessel worthy of carrying it. The air in the week leading up to the competency hearing grew heavy and electric, charged with the unsaid and the anticipated. For the children of Arthur Morgan, it was the heady atmosphere of imminent victory. They had built what they believed to be an unassailable case. Their lawyer, Mr. Shaw, had compiled a thick binder overflowing with their proof. Hours of security footage showing Arthur pacing aimlessly or talking to himself. Maria's meticulously fabricated logs detailing his episodes of confusion, and sworn affidavits from 2 disgruntled former employees. Leo had handsomely paid to recall instances of their former boss's erratic behavior. They looked upon their creation with the pride of master builders, never suspecting that the architect of their entire case was the very man they sought to condemn. Their victory was so certain in their minds that they had already begun to inhabit the future it would bring. Leo, no longer bothering to conceal his ambition, spent his days in clandestine meetings with a corporate acquisition team from a faceless conglomerate known for buying family businesses and stripping them for parts. On a secure video call, he spoke of his father's company as if it were already his to sell. The brand has significant legacy value, Leo explained, his voice smooth and corporate. But its operational model is archaic. Post-transition, we'll be looking at a complete supply chain overhaul. We can triple output within 18 months by moving production offshore. He was negotiating the sale of his father's soul, and his only concern was getting the best possible price. He felt no sentiment, no remorse. It was simply the final, most profitable move in a game he was convinced he had already won. Clara, meanwhile, was engaged in her own form of premature conquest. She and her husband Gregory had architects and interior designers on retainer. Spread across the dining room table, the very table her father had built for her mother, were blueprints and fabric swatches. "We'll start with the West Wing," she declared, pointing with a perfectly manicured finger. Arthur's dreary study can be converted into a beautiful spa and wellness center, and the greenhouse, well, a climate-controlled wine cellar, would be far more practical, don't you think? She was planning the erasure of her parents' memory from the house, eagerly plotting to plaster over their history with her own shallow aesthetic. Even Ethan, the reluctant conspirator, was drawn into the celebration. Leo had a brand new, silver Aston Martin delivered to his driveway, a down payment on his cooperation, as Leo called it. Ethan ran his hand over its polished hood, the thrill of the powerful machine warring with the sick knot of guilt in his stomach. He was being paid for his silence, for his betrayal, and as he slid into the leather driver's seat, he chose to silence his conscience with the roar of a 12-cylinder engine. The children were united in their hubris, utterly blind to the reality of their situation. While they were busy spending their inheritance, Arthur Morgan was putting the final, crucial pieces of his own plan into place. The nighttime sessions with David Davies were no longer about dismantling the old empire, but about solidifying the new one. The last of the assets had been transferred to the Eleanor Morgan Legacy Trust, a financial fortress that was now legally impenetrable. And then came the most important confirmation of all. David, his face grim but his eyes conveying the gravity of his news, delivered the results of his private investigation. "Arthur," he said over their secure line, "we found her. More than that, we found a birth certificate from 41 years ago. The mother is listed as Amelia Rose. The father is listed as unknown. And with the DNA sample you provided from the glass Sarah drank from, it's a 99.99% match. She is your daughter." Arthur closed his eyes, absorbing the words. It was a truth that resonated deep in his soul, a fact he had somehow already known. The knowledge did not bring him explosive joy, but a deep, profound sense of purpose. His war was no longer an act of vengeance, it was an act of rightful succession. He was not just disinheriting the unworthy, he was crowning the worthy. The final piece was in place. It was time to spring the trap. "The next morning, Mr. Shaw received a call from David Davies. Davies, a master actor in his own right, adopted a tone of weary resignation and defeat. He explained that his client, Mr. Morgan, was in a fragile state. The thought of a public, drawn-out court battle, of having his private life exposed, was causing him immense distress. "My client is an old man who wishes to live out his remaining time in peace," Davies sighed. "He is prepared to negotiate. He is willing to concede significant control of his financial and business affairs to his children in exchange for avoiding the humiliation of a public hearing." Shaw listened, a smug smile spreading across his face. It was exactly as he had predicted. The old man had no stomach for a fight. Davies then made the final offer. "Mr. Morgan has requested one final family meeting to be held at my office. He wishes to discuss the terms of a peaceful transition directly with his children. To say his piece, and to sign what needs to be signed." When Shaw relayed the offer, Leo, Clara, and Ethan reacted with predictable arrogance. "He's broken," Leo declared, slamming his hand on his desk in triumph. "He knows we have him cornered." "This isn't a negotiation, it's a surrender ceremony." "It's about his pride," Clara added, examining her nails. "He can't bear the thought of his friends at the club reading about his incompetence in the newspapers. He wants to bury it, and we'll let him, as long as he gives us what we want." They agreed to the meeting without a moment's hesitation. It was the perfect end to their perfect plan. They would march into the lawyer's office, watch their father formally capitulate, and emerge as the new heads of the Morgan dynasty. The meeting was set for Friday at 10 o'clock, 2 days before the scheduled court hearing. The trap was now fully and irrevocably set. The bait had been taken with greedy enthusiasm, and the 3 unsuspecting predators, dressed in their finest clothes for the occasion, prepared to walk willingly and triumphantly into the lion's den. The conference room at the law offices of Davies, and Finch was a chamber of quiet, expensive power. The air smelled of old leather, lemon polish, and the finality of legally binding decisions. A long, dark mahogany table, so polished it reflected the grim faces around it, served as the battlefield. On one side sat Leo, Clara, Ethan, and their lawyer, Mr. Shaw. They were a portrait of corporate raiders on the verge of a successful takeover, confident, poised, and radiating an almost unbearable smugness. On the other side sat Arthur, looking diminished in his large leather chair, a shawl draped over his shoulders as a prop of frailty. Beside him, David Davies was a stoic and unreadable presence, his hands steepled before him. The children saw a pathetic, final gathering, the last twitch of a dying lion. They had come not to negotiate, but to accept a surrender. Mr. Shaw, sensing the moment, began the proceedings. His voice was a silken, condescending balm, intended to soothe a defeated foe. "We are all here today," he began, "to find an amicable path forward that respects both Mr. Morgan's dignity and the practical realities of the situation. My clients, out of the deepest love and concern, have prepared a proposal." He slid a leather-bound folder across the table. "They will assume full fiduciary control of all assets and business operations. Mr. Morgan will, of course, be granted a generous stipend and will retain residency in the family home for as long as he wishes. It is a compassionate arrangement, designed to protect him from the burdens of his own condition." He finished with a small, self-satisfied smile, leaning back as if he had just solved a complex and tedious puzzle. All eyes turned to Arthur, expecting a sigh, a weak nod, the scratch of a pen signing his life away. Instead, it was David Davies who leaned forward, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Thank you for that presentation, Mr. Shaw," he said, his voice cutting through the smug atmosphere like a shard of glass. "It was, as you said, an arrangement. However, we are not here today to discuss your client's proposal. We are here to witness a reckoning." He picked up a small remote control. "You have compiled a case based on your own observations. Allow me to present some of mine." The large screen on the wall, which the children had assumed was for a corporate presentation, flickered to life. The first image was a high-definition shot of the Morgan family living room, taken from a familiar angle. Clara audibly gasped. It was the feed from their own spy camera. But the montage that followed was not the one they had curated. It was Arthur's cut. There was Leo, on the phone in the hallway, his back to the camera, his voice crystal clear. "The faster we get this done, the faster we can stop the bleeding from his hobbies." There was Clara, talking to Gregory on her cell phone in the garden. "Once we have control, the art collection alone will fund the Aspen House." Clip after clip played, a highlight reel of their own greed and contempt, their whispers and plots laid bare in the sterile silence of the conference room. The color drained from their faces, replaced by a pasty, sickly shock. "That's illegal," Leo sputtered, finding his voice. "You can't record us." Davies didn't even look at him. In the state of Connecticut, a property owner is permitted to record video and audio on their own premises, Leo. "You should have read the fine print on the security contract. My client is the property owner. For now." He pressed another button. "And then there is the testimony of your hand-picked observer." He slid a thick, notarized document across the table. It was Maria Flores's sworn affidavit, 20 pages long, detailing every lie they had told her, every instruction they had given, every act of manipulation and neglect she had witnessed. Their jaws went slack. They were not the hunters. They had been the observed, the studied, the prey. As the screen went dark, a transformation occurred. Arthur Morgan, the frail old man, began to straighten in his chair. He slowly, deliberately, removed the shawl from his shoulders and folded it with precise movements. He sat up to his full height, and the power that had been dormant within him for months returned to his eyes, a brilliant, cold fire. The ghost was gone. The king was back on his throne. He looked at his children, and when he finally spoke, his voice was not the weak, wavering tone he had practiced for months. It was the voice that had built an empire, a voice that could cut steel. "You came here to protect me from my condition," he began, the words low and devastating. "You were right to be concerned. My condition is that I have been a fool. I mistook weakness and appetite for love. I see my error now." He fixed his gaze on his eldest son. "Leo, you wanted to be me, but you have none of my heart. You see a forest, and you can only calculate the board feet of lumber. You never learned to see the beauty of the trees. You wanted to be a king, but you only know how to loot the treasury. You do not know how to build." He then turned to Clara. "You complained that I was not the man I used to be. You were right. The man I used to be would never have tolerated a daughter so hollow, so defined by the things she owns that she has no room left for a soul. You wanted my home so you could erase my wife's memory from its walls. You are a parasite, Clara, and the host is now refusing to feed you." His eyes finally fell on Ethan, who was visibly trembling. "And you, Ethan, the saddest of all. You had a conscience, but you sold it for a sports car. You stood by and watched as they prepared to slaughter your own father, and your only contribution was to hold the knife steady for them. Your silence was the cruelest cut of all." He let the judgment hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, mortal blow. "You came here today to take my fortune," he said, his voice dropping to an icy calm. "A fortune you believe you are owed. But the man you tried to have declared mentally incompetent has been very, very busy. For the past 6 months, while you were filming my episodes, I was executing the single largest transaction of my life." He paused, savoring the moment, the dawning horror in their eyes. 95% of my personal assets, every piece of valuable real estate, the entirety of my stock portfolio, and, most importantly, the land, patents, and proprietary ownership of the very heart of Morgan and Sons Fine Woods have been legally and irrevocably transferred to a newly established philanthropic entity. It is called the Eleanor Morgan Legacy Trust. He stood up, his presence now dominating the room. "The company you are fighting over is a shell. The money is gone. The kingdom you sought to conquer no longer exists. Not for you." He looked at their shattered, disbelieving faces. "This meeting is over. You came for a surrender. You have one. Your own." With that, Arthur Morgan turned and walked out of the room, leaving his children sitting in the ruins of their own greed, sentenced to a future they could never have imagined. For a long, cavernous moment after the door clicked shut, the only sound in the conference room was the frantic, useless shuffling of papers by Mr. Fordings by Mr. Sove. Shaw, a man witnessing the instantaneous implosion of his own career. Leo, Clara, and Ethan remained frozen, their faces etched with a profound, almost comical disbelief. The reality of what had just happened was too immense, too absolute to be processed. It was a tactical strike so clean and so devastating that they were still standing amidst the rubble, unaware that their entire world had been vaporized. Leo was the first to detonate. The shock curdled into a volcanic rage. He lunged to his feet, his chair screeching backward, his face a mottled, apoplectic purple. "A trick," he roared, his voice cracking. "It's a goddamn bluff. He's senile. We have proof." He whirled on his own lawyer. "Shaw, do something. Sue him. Sue Davies. This is illegal. He can't just give everything away." Clara's reaction was a different kind of explosion, an implosion of hysteria. The mask of the elegant socialite melted away, revealing the terrified, grasping child beneath. Sobs racked her body, ugly and convulsive. "No, no, no," she wailed, her words devolving into a frantic chant. She turned to David Davies, her eyes wild with panic, appealing to the man she had considered a dusty old relic just minutes before. "Please, David, you can't let him do this. It's everything. Our children's futures. The house. It's our birthright. He's our father." The word birthright hung in the air, a pathetic testament to the depth of her entitlement. Ethan, meanwhile, simply folded. He made no sound, no sudden movement. He just sank in on himself, placing his head in his hands on the polished table, his shoulders shaking in silent, complete and utter despair. He was a man crushed by the weight of a choice he was too weak to make, and a consequence he was too weak to bear. David Davies watched this predictable eruption of greed and panic with the impassive calm of a mountain observing a thunderstorm in the valley below. He let their initial fury burn itself out before he spoke, his voice level and devoid of any sympathy. He addressed Leo first. "Threats of legal action are pointless, Leo," he stated, his tone chillingly matter-of-fact. "While you were busy collecting videos of your father talking to a portrait, I was accompanying him to monthly cognitive evaluations with a panel of the country's top neurologists. We have a file, 3 inches thick, filled with medical and psychiatric testimony that your father's mind is not just sound, but exceptionally sharp. Any legal challenge you mount will be summarily dismissed, and you will then find yourselves facing a countersuit for attempted fraud, conspiracy, and malicious prosecution. I assure you, it is not a fight you can win." He let that sink in before turning to Clara. "As for your birthright, Clara, the law is quite clear. A person of sound mind is free to do with their assets as they see fit. Your father no longer owns the things you covet. They were legally transferred to an independent entity, the Eleanor Morgan Legacy Trust. You cannot claim a right to something that no longer exists in his estate." As if on cue, the conference room door opened again, and Arthur stepped back inside. He hadn't been fleeing. He had been waiting, allowing the cold, hard facts of the law to douse the flames of their emotion. His return commanded an immediate, fearful silence. He was no longer their father. He was their judge, returned to deliver the final sentencing. He walked to the head of the table and looked down at the wreckage of his family. "You seem to be under the impression that you will be left with nothing," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying an edge of iron. "That would be unnecessarily cruel. And I am not a cruel man. I am a just one." He gestured to Davies, who slid 3 simple one-page documents across the table. "The trust contains a minor provision. It will provide each of you with a monthly stipend. It is equivalent to the salary I paid my very first apprentice craftsman, adjusted for inflation. It is enough to pay for a modest apartment, for groceries, and for utilities. It is not enough for country clubs, European cars, or winter coats made of sable." He paused, letting them absorb this final, exquisitely crafted insult. He was giving them not poverty, but a life of ordinary work, a life they had always looked down upon with disdain. "You wanted the fruits of my labor," he continued, "but you never respected the labor itself. You saw the calluses on my hands as a sign of a lesser man, not as the price of the life you enjoyed. Perhaps now you will finally learn the value of $1 when you are forced to earn one. He looked at their shattered faces, one by one. There was no hatred in his eyes, not anymore. There was only a vast, empty space where a father's love used to be. You tried to take my name, my mind, and my dignity. In return, I have taken your inheritance. I took the money you worshipped, and I have dedicated it to the values you mocked: integrity, craftsmanship, and legacy. It was Clara who, in a final, desperate gasp, asked the question that still hung in the air. "So it's all just gone?" she whimpered. "It's all going to strangers? Who gets it? Who is in charge?" Arthur looked at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, a flicker of something new entered the equation. It wasn't about what they had lost. It was about who had won. "The trust," Arthur said slowly, "will of course require a guiding hand, a successor to ensure the legacy is protected, to ensure the work continues." He looked at each of them, forcing them to meet his gaze. "I have already found that person." He did not elaborate. He offered no name, no clue. He simply planted that final, agonizing seed of mystery in the barren soil of their ruin. They had lost everything, and now they were forced to imagine an unknown face, a stranger, sitting on their throne, ruling their kingdom. It was the final, perfect twist of the knife. Without another word, Arthur Morgan turned and walked out of the room for the last time, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He left his children stripped not only of their fortune, but of their future, haunted by the specter of their own replacement. The reckoning was over. The unveiling was complete. The final act of the Morgan family drama did not play out in a sterile conference room or a contentious courtroom, but in the quiet, honest air of Arthur's personal workshop. Weeks after the reckoning, the space was filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with a palpable sense of a new beginning. A small group had gathered, not the sharks of the business world, but reporters from arts publications, members of the Artisans Guild, and the humble board of the foundation Arthur had secretly supported for years. Arthur stood before them, not as a titan or a victim, but simply as a craftsman. He looked 10 years younger, the heavy burden of his performance and his children's betrayal lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a calm, bright clarity. He spoke of the Eleanor Morgan Legacy Trust, of its mission to preserve the soul of American craftsmanship. And then, he came to the question that had been the subject of intense speculation. "A legacy is not a pile of money to be divided," Arthur said, his voice steady and clear. "It is a living thing, a fire that must be tended and passed on. For a long time, I feared my fire would be extinguished, but a great and unexpected gift has shown me that it will not." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "I would like to introduce you to the person who will be the new chair of the trust and the guardian of its mission." He turned and gestured to the side, where Sarah stood, her expression a mixture of nervousness and quiet strength. As she stepped forward, David Davies also moved to the lectern, holding a thin file. "For the sake of clarity and legal record," Davies announced, his voice resonating with historical import, "let me present to you a copy of a birth certificate and the results of a conclusive DNA test. The trust, the legacy, and the future of the Morgan name will be entrusted to its sole and rightful heir. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Sarah Morgan." A quiet gasp rippled through the small crowd. Sarah, this unassuming young woman, was his daughter. The lost child had been found, the broken line of succession restored. Sarah spoke, her voice not loud, but filled with a sincerity that commanded attention. She spoke of her mother, and of a father she was only just beginning to know. But mostly, she spoke of the future. "The Eleanor Morgan legacy is not a corporation," she stated, her words resonating with her father's own philosophy. "We will not be focused on quarterly earnings, but on generational impact. Our first act will be to establish a scholarship fund for young apprentices in the manual arts. Our second will be to create grants to support master craftsmen who are struggling to keep their traditions alive. My father built an empire of things. We will now build a community of values." In that moment, Arthur's victory was complete. He hadn't just saved his fortune. He had given it a soul. And what of the children who had been so certain of their inheritance? Their worlds had unraveled with brutal speed. Leo, stripped of his title and his reputation, was last seen working a mid-level management job for a logistics company, his grand ambitions reduced to optimizing shipping routes in a cubicle. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the quiet desperation of a man who has fallen from a great height and has no idea how to climb back up. Clara and Gregory's marriage, a union built on the expectation of future wealth, fractured under the weight of their new, modest reality. Their mansion was sold, the designer clothes consigned, their names erased from the guest lists of the galas they once ruled. They were left with nothing but a house full of recriminations and the bitter taste of a life they had almost touched. And Ethan, the weakest and perhaps most tragic of them all, was forced into the kind of simple, honest labor he had always avoided. He worked for a landscaping company, his soft hands now calloused and rough. In the quiet, repetitive work of digging and planting, there was a humility he had never known, but there was also a profound loneliness, a life sentence of knowing he had stood before a choice between courage and comfort and had chosen wrong. The final scene of Arthur Morgan's story is not one of vengeance, but of peace. Months later, as autumn once again painted the Connecticut hills in hues of gold and crimson, the sound of gentle, rhythmic sanding could be heard from the small workshop. Inside, Arthur was showing Sarah how to finish a piece of cherry wood, his aged hands guiding hers. He was explaining how to read the grain, how to feel when the wood was ready. They worked in a comfortable silence, the shared language of their craft flowing between them. He was not just teaching her a skill, he was giving her his time, his knowledge, his love, the true inheritance. He had found his daughter, and in doing so, he had found the part of himself he thought was lost forever. So let this story serve as a quiet reminder. Never underestimate the silence of a man who has endured too much. For in that silence, he is not surrendering. He is observing, he is planning, and he is sharpening the blade of a justice that, when it finally falls, is as swift, as clean, and as absolute as a master craftsman's final, perfect cut. Thank you for listening. Join us next time as we unlock the door to another house and uncover another story from the heart of the family.